Now, shortly before the confidence vote, the government had suffered another defeat on its devolution policy. The referendum of the 1st of March 1979 failed to deliver devolution for Scotland, a failure that cost Labour the support it desperately needed from the Scottish National Party MPs. Otherwise, they could and would have rescued the government that night. The Scottish referendum failed because the yes vote failed to reach the necessary threshold of 40% of the electorate, which had been set by Parliament. The moving spirit behind the 40% requirement was George Cunningham, then a Labour MP and a Scot representing a London constituency. At a recent conference, Mr Cunningham discussed the impact of the referendum and the mechanics of running a government in a hung Parliament.
Yes, I have the difficulty that whereas in the two previous sessions there was probably almost no one, certainly in respect of the first, who could actively remember what happened during the elections they were talking about, in this room I'm sure we have many people who were actively engaged in the affairs, in political affairs, in those two parliaments, the short one in 1974 and the long one which followed from October 74 to 79. And of course, there are so many characteristics of those years which are so totally different to what we have experienced since the Blair victory of 97. Because so many people in the room have direct experience of that time, is to recollect with you certain characteristics of that period, which certainly do not apply now. And the first obvious one is that right from the outset, the Labour government of 74 to 79 was on a knife edge. Such a knife edge that Ted Heath, after the first 74 election, thought there was a chance that he might get the Liberals to go with him and that he could continue as Prime Minister. And so very rarely Harold Wilson, in those few days after the February 74 election, he had a couple of days, it wasn't much more than that, before he actually had to take office. It's not comparable to the 3 months and more that an American presidential candidate has to sort himself out before actually taking office, but Harold Wilson had that. So it started on a knife edge, and the knife edge didn't get much less sharp after the October election. After that October election, at least the Labour government had a majority over the Conservatives, but it was rapidly diminished in by-elections, and so it was knife-edge living all the time. A second element in those years is Europe. You had the Labour Party deeply divided about Europe and other things, but certainly about Europe. You had the fact that a significant number of Labour members and distinguished Labour members had voted against their own party, and so Harold Wilson had to live with that divide within the party. And of course he did a typical Harold Wilson thing. He took the idea of the referendum, which had been promoted, of course, by Tony Benn, and used that with, in the end, he was lucky, magnificent effect, so far as he as the leader of the party was concerned, to resolve the problem, in that he allowed even cabinet ministers to stand on opposite sides of platforms and argue against each other on the Europe issue. And then when the referendum, that is in the campaign for the referendum, and then when the referendum result was 2-1 in favour of staying in what we then refer to as the European Community, then the whole thing eased. and just recollect how serious that opposition to Europe was before that happened. The Labour government refused to send what we then referred to as a delegation to the European Parliament. We were in the European community. We were entitled to send send MEPs chosen by the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but actually we refused to do so. That was the depth of the remaining hostility to the European idea. Then, of course, right running through the whole of that Parliament, and this clearly makes it very different from the situation after 97, was the economic situation, which was a deep pain right through those years. So you were never free of it. There were constant crises coming up in the House about that. There's also something to be said about the party leaders during that time. Of course, there was the change. Maggie had beaten Ted Heath in the election to his everlasting mortification. Wilson resigns suddenly in 75, in 76, and Callaghan comes in. But those two changes don't really much affect the general political situation. There wasn't any great crisis about those changes. There was an immense surprise, both that Maggie managed to beat Heath and that Harold Wilson resigned. And of course, there were people who certainly said that they knew he was going to do that sometime before, and I dare say one or two of them did. But to most people, it came as a total surprise. It's one of these events where I think you always remember where you were when you first heard it. I know where I was. It was in the House of Commons library, Priscilla, and Eric Heffer came bowling in with this news that Harold had resigned. But despite that traumatic event for the party in a way, it didn't really shake up the general political situation of those years. Now, another characteristic is that the government was constantly being defeated in votes in the House of Commons, well documented by Philip in his one or two books. And the government just had to live with that situation. I think of it this way, that in the first major defeat on a three-line whip, it was the vote in January 75 on the pension rule, the rule which meant that if you were in the first 5 years of retirement, if you had earnings as well as your pension, then for every pound of those earnings, your pension was cut by 50 pence. And that came to a vote on a motion actually by dear old Brandon Rees-Williams, but it was some of us in the Labour Party who really organised the defeat of the government on that issue. Now that was January 1975, and certainly since I was regarded as the leader of the revolters on that occasion, I took it for granted that I would not get put on standing committees. I'll use the old terminology, standing committees for quite a while, and for a while I wasn't. But gradually it became clear that you could actually say to your colleagues, I'd like to talk to you about such and such a thing. I think the government's got it wrong. And instead of them saying, oh, she's just bloody Cunningham rebelling against his own side again, no, you could get a response from people. Now, whether you got a more active response because there really was a chance of defeating the government on it and substituting your judgment for the government's judgment on an issue, who knows? But you could do that. So it was a whole parliament in which voting against your own side was not regarded as a cardinal sin, nor was it regarded as something which debarred you from ministerial office. That was a change which was introduced by Maggie, who never appointed ministers from amongst the rebels. But in the days before Maggie, and certainly the period that I'm talking about, there were people who were rebels but who were given ministerial office. So it was a scene in the House of Commons which ministers just had to get accustomed to. And one of the events also in that context that I remember is the Horam report. Yes, it's the same Horam as survives in the Commons today as a Conservative member for, what is it, Bromley or something. And he was given the task, taken over from someone else, of recommending measures which would get relations between ministers and backbenchers better. And one of the recommendations was that ministers had to consult with the chairman of backbench subject committees regularly. And I was, by this time I had been forgiven or forgotten, and so I was chairman of a couple of backbench committees. And Stan Orme was the relevant minister for one of those on social security. And so Stan Orme, under the Horam report rules, was supposed to come to me and go over things that were arising to avoid problems in the future. And that worked. The government recognised that they were subject to defeat and that they had to have better relations with backbenchers in order to avoid that. I might say that the other minister who was supposed to consult with me was the leader of the House for a time, Michael Foot. And whereas Stan Orme was extremely good about consulting, Michael Foot, against his sort of reputation, was very bad at consulting. You would have a meeting with him and he would slap his leg in Michael's fashion and say, well, we shall have to see, we'll have to see. But the consultation was non-existent. The point I'm making is that ministers realised then that they just had to live with that situation and make the best of it. A huge issue, and Philip has referred to it, running right through this, was devolution. It started just as a time bomb that ticked very lightly, but then became, of course, bigger and bigger. And its first major defeat, of course, it was Tam Dalyell, who raised the temper, the temper as well as the tempo of everything, with his endless, relentless speeches about this and that would be ruined by devolution. And he moved masses of amendments, with the result that the government in 1977 could not pass its guillotine motion. They were trying to get the bill through. This is the first bill applying to both Scotland and Wales. They were trying to get it through without a guillotine motion, a timetable motion, we'd say today. But with Tam going on and on and on, then it was clear that they weren't going to get the bill unless they had a guillotine motion. And so they tried it. And then they were surprised that enough of us voted against that guillotine motion that it didn't pass. So that was the end of that bill for that session. Actually, the government did try to carry on with discussion of the bill. And that led to an interesting intervention by Enoch Powell, when we'd had a day or whatever discussing this bill, which was really now dead. And Enoch said, there's an interesting atmosphere in the House tonight. I couldn't place it. But then I realized, yes, it's like in a house where there's been a recent bereavement. And the body is still in the house, so much the same and yet so strangely changed. And that is like it is, as it is now in the House tonight with this bill, which everybody knew was going nowhere, but was still being discussed. So, of course, the government brought forward in the next year the two bills, separate bills for Scotland and Wales. And there were enough of us, both on the back benches and, it should be said, in government, who were opposed to it for there to be a real possibility not of defeating it directly, but of undermining it. And that, I suppose, is what my amendment would be regarded as doing. That was the amendment which said that in the referendum, which the government had reluctantly agreed to hold in Scotland and in Wales on devolution, then unless 40% of the total electorate voted yes, then the matter had to come back to the House. It didn't kill the bill, but it said it had to come back to the House. Now, the point I'm making is that in addition to little defeats on relatively minor things like the pensions rule and so on, you had this massive issue of devolution occupying an enormous amount of parliamentary time, which was going on all the time. And may I say that in addition to some ministers, who of course were not going to vote against it, of course that's totally impossible, some ministers who were mentally against it, I would mention Joe Barnett, say, and Robert Sheldon, but other ministers as well, who I won't say were encouraging us rebels to do what we were doing, but we knew that within the government there was opposition to that. It was also the case, though this didn't matter in practice, that the Speaker, George Thomas, was against devolution, and that the Chairman of Ways and Means, Meyer Galpin, former Lord Provost of Glasgow, was also opposed. Indeed, Meyer at one stage said, the devolution bill, I'd throw it in the Clyde. No, I wouldn't, it would pollute the Clyde. Now, neither the Speaker nor the Chairman of Ways and Means allowed their opposition to affect anything at all. But the fact is there was that hostility, which is entirely different, of course, to the situation after the election in 1997. Now, another, I'm taking for granted the winter of discontent, which was such a major contributory factor in defeating the government. But another characteristic of the whole of those years, big fishes. There were people around like Tony Crossland, Dennis Healy, Crossman for part of the time, Roy Jenkins. There were people of immense stature as recognised by the public and their colleagues, which I suggest hasn't existed after 1997. So those, it seems to me, are the characteristics of that period, so different from what exists now, that I draw to your attention for the purposes of further discussion.